Welcome to the last useState tutorial you're ever going to have to watch. I promise you, if you watch this video, you're going to understand useState completely. You're going to know how to use it, when to use it, and even you'll be able to go out and teach this to others and look like a senior. Does this sound good to you? Great. Let's jump on my computer screen and learn about useState. All right, cool. So we're now on my computer and I have here a very simple application that we're going to use to learn how to work with useState. But before we get started implementing this hook, we have to understand what state is, because that is very important. That's a very important concept in applications in general. State, the simplest way that you can think about this is data that changes with time, right? Data that can be different from one point in time to another. Or if we're talking about React, that can be different from one render to another. Because what we're doing here is we're creating renders, we're rendering JSX, and every time we render this piece of state, currently we have none, but state can be different. So a simple example is, think of a loading spinner, right? We're fetching some data from an API, and while that data is being fetched, we want to show a loading spinner to the user, right? Because we want to show that something is happening in our application. To do that, we might have a piece of state that we'll call loading, and that will be set to true when the request is being fired. And then when the request returns the response, our loading is going to be set to false, and then our data is going to be displayed. Our data is also state because it can also be different, right? Before we fetched the request, there was no data. So data was undefined or an empty list or whatever. But after we fetched our data, the data then becomes the data that we get from the server. You can also imagine that we would do something similar with an error. Say that something happened during our request. We want to show the user an error. Maybe we want to send a notification. We want to do something. We need to track the state of our component. Is it loading? Is it error? Or do we have data? That is state. Remember, state is any piece of information that can change over time across renders in React. Cool. So now that we understand what state is, let's start implementing useState, because useState is the hook that you use in React to manipulate state. To do that, we're going to create a simple counter application. It's going to be very simple. It's just going to have one simple counter and two buttons, one to increment and one to decrement the counter. So let's begin. First, what we're going to do is we're going to import useState from React. So we'll do import and then useState from React. And then we'll create just a little bit of space here. And then we want to create our state variable. So what we'll do is we'll do const, and then we're going to open an array. And here's how useState works. The first variable in the array, because there can only be two, the first variable in the array is always the state variable. What is it that we're trying to display here, right? In our case, it's going to be the count, because we want to keep track of the count. And then we're going to have two buttons that increment or decrement the count. So our variable is going to be count. Then you want to do a comma, and the second element in this array is always going to be the updater function that updates the count. In our case, yes, the count, the state, right? So we're going to call this set count. Now, I want to take a moment to pause here and mention that I could have named these in any way that I wanted. I didn't have to put count here. I didn't have to put set count. I could have put berries and then set data or whatever. They don't have to match. However, as is in programming, you first want to give a very descriptive name to the actual variable that holds the state. And then by convention, the updater function is always going to be set and then whatever the variable name is. Again, you don't have to do this. Nothing is going to break. There's no errors that are going to happen, but it is best practice to always call this set and then the variable name. Because if you think about it, it makes sense, right? You have a variable, you have some piece of state, and you want to update it. So the updater function is going to set that variable. So it should be called set whatever it is. In our case, set count. Cool. And then we're going to do equals useState, and then we're going to put a parenthesis here. Now, if I save this like this and then come here in my component and remove this and then put count and then display our count, right? We're going to do this. And if we save, you're going to see that all that is shown is count. There's no actual count being displayed, right? Ideally, we maybe would want a 0 because we would start our counter at 0 and then we can go up or down from there. But nothing is being shown. Why is that? Well, it is because we have not provided a default value. State can take a default value, and if you don't provide one, then it is going to be undefined, right? Our count currently is undefined. So to fix that, we can put a default value in the parenthesis here. If I do this and save, then you'll see that our count is there. That is how useState works. You define your variable, you define the updater function, and then optionally, you can provide a default value, which is very useful because you have a lot of cases where you would need state and you would want your state to start with some default value. Perhaps you have some data in the cache that you want to load or whatever, right? You want to start it with a default value, so that's how you use it. So with this, we now have state. It is shown our application has now become stateful, which means that it uses some piece of state in its components. Cool, so we have state, but we have no way to update the state. So let's fix that. Let's create two buttons. I'm gonna start by creating one button, and then I'm gonna call this one increment, if I can spell it, increment. And then I'm gonna give it to, first of all, if I click this right now, nothing happens, right? Because we did not attach anything to its onClick event listener. So let's do that. I'm gonna put onClick, and then I'm going to give it an inline arrow function. So that looks like this. And then I'm going to do set count. And then what is the new value that we want to put, right? This button is increment, which means that we want it to do whatever the count currently is and add 1 to it. So simply I will do count, right? Which is the current value of our count plus 1. If I save this, let's see what happens to our app. I click, it goes up to 1. I click, it goes up to 2. I click, it goes up to 3. This function on click will take the current count, right, plus 1, and then it will set the count to that. That is very simple. There's not that much more to it. We could have done anything here. We could have, instead of doing this, we could have put 100, right? If we then click, it's going to set it to 100. If I then click again, it's going to set it to 100 again, but it is already 100. So nothing is really happening, right? You're free to do this however you want. The goal here is that we have set count and we're using this function to manipulate the state. So now let's just copy this and then put it once here and then do decrement. And then instead of count plus 1, we're going to do count minus 1. Now we have two buttons. I can increment it and I can decrement it, and the buttons behave as we want it to, right? This is in its simplest form how to use useState. You now know how to have state, how to update the state, how to set its default value, and with this you can literally do anything that you want in your application, which is good because most applications, if not all applications, have some sort of state and use this hook in their code base, right? So it's a very crucial skill to understand. All right, cool. So there you go. That was useState. I told you it was going to be simple, right? You can now go out and use it in any application that you work on. And like I told you in the beginning of the video, you can go out and teach this to someone and look like a senior developer. If you've enjoyed this video, make sure to subscribe because I am going to be posting a lot more of these. I'm fully dedicated to this right now. Tutorials on React in all shapes and sizes, they're coming. And yeah, my name is Darius Kozin. This is Kozin Solutions, and I will see you all in the next video. Ciao, ciao.